It's really such a pleasure for me to be here with all of you. And it's been wonderful to have the opportunity to do this work. So I'm the one who needs to thank you, Chris, for having this conversation about what else could we do for philanthropy in Brazil. So as Chris mentioned, I'm Silvia Bastante de Unverhau. I'm originally from Lima, from Peru, neighboring country. And I was having a conversation with a few people last week, because now I'm living in Switzerland. And they said, how do you like living in Switzerland? And I said, you know what, it's a nice country, it's very clean, it's very safe, but the people who can make trains run on time cannot make good carnival. So I certainly feel very happy to be in Brazil with all of you. So the report that we're discussing today was based on interviews to 21 philanthropists and also to 21 professional and experts. And the question was whether philanthropy in Brazil is sufficiently supporting systems change initiatives, and also the ultimate objective is really to increase the amounts that are given and to make them more conducive for social and environmental justice. I think what we're all looking for, and what we put on the last page of the report, is the goal is a fair, just and inclusive society where all Brazilians can reach their full potential. The report has 10 key findings that I'll run you through relatively briefly, but you all have the copy in front of you and you can also read it for yourself. The first finding is about the context and motivations. I won't tell you about the context for philanthropy in Brazil because you know it better than I do. Just to say that the history of colonization, slavery, military dictatorship, as well as the historical influence of the Catholic Church have, up to a certain point, shaped the space for philanthropy in Brazil. But Brazilian philanthropy has been growing significantly. It has almost doubled over the last decade. The GIFER report from 2010 was around 500 million, and already by 2020 we're seeing around 1 billion. Though there is no common definition of philanthropy, most philanthropists that I had the conversations with define philanthropy as using private capital for the public good or just the love of humanity. And many of them talked about reducing inequalities, promoting social justice, as well as protecting the environment. Now, what is interesting is that 17 of the 21 philanthropists thought that it's about giving money, but it's also volunteering, it's also giving business expertise and other supports. And 11 of 21 of them thought it's about solving problems, especially those that the government can't. And we're going to look a little bit more into the topic of the relationship between philanthropy and government a little bit later. I like this quote: philanthropy is to give back not only money, but can be volunteering as well. It is to try to balance a little the differences in society, because I'm in this fortunate position, I can give back. And that was one of the philanthropists. And the biggest motivators are very much in line with everything I've seen from studies that I've done in many different parts of the world. It's about family values, sense of responsibility, and observing injustice and inequality. Moving to the second finding, it's estimated giving. And in many of my conversations, people said that giving had increased very significantly because of the COVID pandemic. And in line with what we have found in many different parts of the world, unfortunately, it seems that the surge in the donations is only temporary, meaning it has not led to fundamentally different giving behaviors. Many parts of the world, the levels are already down to what giving was back in 2019, and I think that's also the case for Brazil. But also, as you probably know, philanthropy in Brazil is very informal. It's people helping their neighbors, the community, the people that they work with. So it's not always counted as philanthropy, and it doesn't go through a legal vehicle. So I think the numbers are usually underestimated. And what's interesting is that giving is common across all socioeconomic levels, with the middle class giving proportionally more. And there is certainly a perception that there is not a lack of wealth in Brazil, but rather a lack of willingness to give significantly among the very wealthy. And then I was just playing around a little bit with the numbers. And if you take the number from GIFE, from the last census, that says it's around $1 billion, and you say, well, this number is highly underestimated because of the informal nature of philanthropy, because people help, it doesn't get counted, for all these reasons, right? So we say, multiply that by 4. We get to 4 billion. Now, if we then say, what would be the share of Brazilian philanthropy per year, given its share of global GDP? I play around with the numbers again, and we get to 20 billion. And if we do the same calculation by the number of billionaires in Brazil, we get to 28 billion, right? So I think from any lens, we could say that Brazilian philanthropy is still relatively low. And especially the wealthy within Brazil could give more. And this quote I quite like: the society is actually filling a gap. They help each other, but they're not givers. It is very difficult to raise money in Brazil, but if you ask someone to help, they all help. If you go into the communities, everybody helps each other even more. Moving on to the next finding, the developments in philanthropy. So Brazilian philanthropy has developed very significantly in the last few years. It's certainly becoming more professional and moving away from a charity approach. Family philanthropy is growing. Of the 21 philanthropists that I had the pleasure of interviewing, 21 have their own philanthropy separate from the corporate philanthropy of their families. They are increasingly focusing on diverse themes, including human rights and social justice. And also, they're increasingly grant-making. 8 of the 21 philanthropists are grant-making completely or for a large part of their giving. The other trend is that social impact investing is growing, and at least 7 of the 21 philanthropists brought up and prompted of sustainable investing and impact investing. And very importantly, they see this as complementary to philanthropy. It's not a completely different practice. And if we look at the figures, I'm sorry, they're relatively small, but you can see them on the report. Still, 80 to 90% is corporate philanthropy, and only 10 to 20% is family philanthropy. Overall, we still have a majority of operating foundations, meaning that they implement their own projects as opposed to grant giving. That figure, and these are just estimates from the conversations, it's not, and obviously I've consulted other reports from IDs and from GIFE as well. And only 20 to 30% is estimated to be grant making. And in terms of the areas, the biggest one is education, no surprise to anybody. I've been told that education, some people have told me it's 90%. You know, I've played around with what I've heard, and I think it's maybe between 60 to 70%. Then there's a little bit for health, a little bit for the environment, but funding for human rights tends to be the lowest percentages. Moving on to the role of philanthropy. Here it starts becoming very interesting from my perspective. There is very little consensus amongst the interviewees about the nature and the role of philanthropy, especially vis-a-vis the public sector. So some people think that philanthropy is really about providing for basic needs and alleviating suffering. And others think that it's more about catalyzing systemic long. The other dichotomy that we see is between people thinking that government should implement programs at scale and set policies and legal frameworks versus the idea of questioning whether philanthropy can actually influence government. How is this supposed to work? And finally, the last one is about whether philanthropy should be the caretaker of democracy and really support civil society and take a position. Versus a different view that says, yes, maybe that's true, but at the same time, it is very difficult to associate with political views. And I mean, obviously the context, the political context in Brazil is a complicated one, and it's one with a great polarization. And I was doing these interviews last September before the last election, so that context certainly influenced. But this leads me to what I consider to be, for myself, one of the key takeaways from this study. In addition to the fact that we want to increase philanthropy in Brazil, which I think it's clear to everybody, the second one for me would be about, in a context like the Brazilian context, it is important for philanthropy to help create spaces for discussion, to help to build democratic values. Even if it doesn't necessarily take a political role, this idea of contributing to the building of the country, to civic education, to democratic values, and taking some sort of position on that front, I think is quite important. Moving on to the fifth finding, and I see people very, very concentrated. I hope that what I'm saying resonates with your own experiences, but obviously we'll have a chance for a few questions afterwards. The next topic is about equality in philanthropy, and here, racial and gender equality, trust-based philanthropy, and prioritizing local knowledge are increasingly discussed but practiced to different degrees. And this is true pretty much around the world. We know that in Brazil in particular, is dealing with the legacy of colonialism and discrimination, and the social structures remain largely in place. Some believe that philanthropy is actually just reproducing colonial forms in this day and age. And I think, and here I'm going out a bit further than the interviews, but this is a shared experience, given that I also come from a country that was colonized, that at a very fundamental level, not everybody believes that being Brazilian or being born in the country truly means that everyone is equal and deserves the same rights and opportunities. I think a little bit the vision of philanthropy, even though it has moved on a lot from the charity approach, there's still a leftover sense of, yes, we help those that are more disadvantaged than us, but looking to change to redress fundamental discrimination in society. So 18 of the 21 philanthropists agreed with promoting racial equality with gender and income intersectionality, 14 of which reflect or try to reflect this diversity in their own organizations, 7 of which are actively funding initiatives that promote racial equality, and only 3 philanthropists told me that equality was not a lens for their philanthropy. And I must say, the sample of philanthropists that we have is very biased to what Chris also mentioned, these progressive philanthropists that are seeing the issues around that I'm trying to do very differently. And obviously all the experts, many of whom are also in the room with us today, also hold these views, but I don't think this is representative of Brazilian philanthropy. Now, in terms of trust, 15 of the 21 philanthropists agreed with the importance of trust-based relationships and recognizing the expertise and knowledge of local organizations. In a different event, an expert in philanthropy from Asia that I know and like a lot said, philanthropy is the only sector where non-experts tell experts how to do their jobs. And I love that quote because I think that's what we're seeing. But it's not only about being an expert, it's about, even consulting people who have lived experience of the issues that we're trying to solve. And most philanthropy in the world is still quite directive, meaning that the money is the power. And it doesn't always listen well enough to people that maybe have different experiences or have the first-hand experience of the issues. I quite like this quote from a philanthropist. He wrote, "I hope that everyone understands that as long as racism and gender discrimination are not solved, we won't solve anything else, as all the other issues are connected to this. And the changes have to be structural. You can't solve everything, but at least let's aim to strengthen the leadership and civil society and encourage public agencies to consider this." So on the topic of trust-based philanthropy, which is also being discussed very, very broadly, among the philanthropists, only 3 out of 21 mentioned the idea of trust-based philanthropy unprompted. I think people believe in trust, but sometimes when you say trust-based philanthropy, there's a general misunderstanding that it just means that you give the money and you don't care for the results. So it's just giving away. And that's not quite what we mean by trust-based philanthropy. Moving on to systems change philanthropy, and we're coming to one of my other favorite findings from this research. What I like, I will start with this quote. It is simply that our social and economic structures do not value equal opportunities. Philanthropy is purely and simply correcting the structural problems for which in some way we are all responsible. So everyone can have opportunities they deserve to be the authors of their own destinies. And this was a philanthropist. And I think the beginning of systems change philanthropy is recognizing privilege. And 33 of the 42 interviewees recognized their privilege. And very importantly, they brought it up unprompted. It wasn't a question that I asked, do you consider yourself privileged? It was really their own reflection when talking about the topic of philanthropy. And also, very interestingly, it wasn't just privilege in the sense that they have a comfortable financial or economic situation and that they can do philanthropy, but even the fact that they can engage in philanthropy. Because unfortunately, in philanthropy, quite a lot of the positions are still also volunteering. And you can only volunteer if you have a relatively comfortable life up to a certain point. And when I asked the experts, what percentage of philanthropy do you think is focused on systems change, the estimated I got is around 5%. But I also wanted to put this in context. This is true pretty much all around the world. I think globally, depending on which market you're speaking about, it's maybe 10, 20%, but it's really not more than that. The majority of philanthropy is still very conservative, very restricted, relatively small amounts. Brazil is certainly in line, but it is certainly growing as well. So 15 of the 21 philanthropists believe in supporting systems change and do so for at least part of their philanthropy. And we had this discussion that there were between 12 to 15 progressive or socially justice-oriented philanthropists within Brazil. And this is really great news because it's not very common, let's put it that way, in different parts of the world, even countries that have the level of inequality that Brazil has. Now, talking about inequality, this is the biggest issue. Like almost every single person I spoke to said to me that the biggest issue in Brazil was inequality. And at the same time, philanthropy alone cannot change the socio-political system that we have created. But where I think it can make a fundamental difference is in supporting the development of a thriving and independent civil society that can help to redress structural discrimination and provide opportunities for all. So this is my third, key take for myself from this study. It's really the role of philanthropy is to support an independent and thriving civil society. That's how I see it, at least, and I would be very interested to continue this conversation with all of you. Oh, did I make a mistake? Oh yeah, it's back. Then we talked a little bit about the philanthropic sector. And the philanthropic sector has certainly become much more strong. A lot of professional support organizations. For example, we have the Grupo de Institutos, Fundaciones y Empresas, GIFE. We have Instituto para el Desenvolvimiento do Investimento Social, IDIS. We also more recently have Stanford Social Innovation Review, the Brazilian edition that is published on philanthropy. And there's worldwide initiatives for grant-making support, WINGS, which is a Global South organization, focused organization, and they're also based in Brazil. So the sector is seen as mature, strong, and utilizing best practices with these strong organizations that are supporting it, but it's still operating in a bubble and facing certain challenges, such as the lack of training and opportunities, the need to further recognize the sector's power, and the need to develop a unique Brazilian identity. And this was quite interesting in some of the conversations, that we cannot just export practices from other countries. Brazil is a very unique country with a unique history, with a unique way of life as well. So I think that the philanthropic practices really need to be brought out from the richness of diversity that you have within your own society. Moving on to the nonprofit and civil society sectors, it faces more challenges The main one, or the main two in my view, are the pervasive lack of trust and confidence in the sector, and also being held to different standards than businesses. And this is, again, true all over the world, and it's fascinating to me how somebody, if they're working on the nonprofit sector, are viewed in a particular way that is not the same as if they're working in business, even if it's exactly the same person. A lot of the experts that I've interviewed have been working first in business for many years, and then they changed, and now they're in philanthropy or nonprofits. And the way they're regarded, even if it's the same person with the same experience, is completely different, because there is just this related to that. Another reflection was about how nonprofits are judged differently from businesses. And of course, there is corruption in every single sector in our societies. And when there's a scandal in the nonprofit sector, people remember it for a very long time, but they're still investing in businesses that may be quoted on the New York Stock Exchange, but they've also had a scandal. So it's not exclusively the nonprofit sector, but people judge the nonprofit sector in a very different way. The priority developmental needs are improving the quality of management, accessing additional and restricted long-term funding, and additional training on how to influence the government, or more broadly on how to affect systems change. When we discuss about systems change, we say, on the one hand, it's about the philanthropists and the foundations giving differently, but on the other hand, it's also about the nonprofit organizations or the social entrepreneurs developing their own visions for systems change and their own ways of getting there. Moving on, to the next finding. This is about promoting and increasing philanthropy. And we have the top 5 topics that were cited across all interviewees. The first one is focusing on increasing meaningful collaborations, such as co-funding and pooling funding, or at a minimum aligning efforts. And here there's a whole spectrum of collaboration between literally pooling your funding together to maybe just knowledge sharing. And in our sample of 21 philanthropists, at least 16 are already co-funding with others, because there's a huge dispersion of efforts in the space. Everybody likes to do their own thing, and it doesn't necessarily add up to the big picture that we all want. But the professionals were a little bit more cautious about whether collaboration is actually happening and to what extent it is. And one of them said, many of the foundations talk about collaboration and they say they are supporting one another. Everybody wants to congratulate one another, even if they haven't done anything real together. So there's a question mark as to how much it's happening. But no doubt everybody thinks that this would be the way to increase impact. And in the report, we also mentioned at least 8 philanthropic collaborations that include one Brazilian funder, such as the End Violence Against Children, the Grupo Mulheres do Brasil, Instituto Clima e Sociedade, Núcleo pela Ciência pela Infância, On Safari, the Rede de Filantropia para Justiça Social, Rede Comoa, and Todos pela Educação. Now, to the next one. This is about improving the legal and tax environment for philanthropy. Almost everybody said that this was very important. And just to say, in my experience globally, the fact that there is a tax deductibility does not necessarily lead the initial decision to give, meaning people give all around the world in places where there is no tax deductibility. However, when there is a tax deduction, the amounts tend to be higher. So I agree with many of the philanthropists and experts that said that finding a better tax regime could really support philanthropy in Brazil. But people had different views of what it should be. So for them, it was about, for some, it was about removing the extra tax that people have to pay on top of donations. For others, it was tax deductibility, so being able to deduce it from your taxes. But at the same time, some people said in Brazil, it will be subject to corruption and it's difficult to certify. Then others said the best thing we could do is raise inheritance taxes. And some others said it's just about more taxes for wealthy people. So we have to fix the tax and regulatory situation, but I cannot tell you exactly what would be the best recommendation within that. Moving on, the third one is the fostering the learning and development of philanthropists. And all of the philanthropists that I interviewed, I mean, obviously I was speaking to the more progressive ones, all talked about their own personal journey, the experience that they have, going on site visits, going on trips, sharing with people in the peripheria, people that maybe did not have the same experiences as they did. So they all focus a little bit on their own personal journey and development as philanthropists. And in my experience, this is very tied to their willingness to support systemic change. And it's also up to a certain point, not even just about personal development, but moving into topics such as consciousness, connected thinking, that type of conversation as well. Moving on to the next one, it's about promoting a culture of giving from a young age and making it socially desirable to engage in philanthropy. And here I like this quote that people know each other socially because they know who they are or which family they're from, but they rarely talk about their philanthropy. I always ask and try to find out if there are some synergies, but I believe there is a bit of a bubble, as even for fundraising events, always the same people go and always the same people give. And this is a very particular thing. It's not only true in Brazil, it's true in other countries in Latin America, where wealthy individuals who are philanthropists know each other, but again, there is no necessarily a social pressure to give, as we find potentially in the United States or in some other countries. So this need to promote a culture of giving is quite important. And there's many initiatives in Brazil. We feature a few of them in the report. We talk about Arredondar, Confluentes, Generation Pledge, Movimento Bem Maior, Movimento por una Cultura de Donação, and a few others as well. So this culture of giving and promoting giving, and not only for the wealthy, but across all socioeconomic groups is important. And the last one is about increasing the visibility of philanthropic role models. And here I've heard different things. So some of the philanthropists in particular say that they don't want to become a role model or to be public because of modesty and humility, and also up to a certain point because of safety considerations and because they don't want to expose themselves to always being asked for additional donations. But one philanthropist questioned these views and explained that, everybody knows I'm wealthy and I feel so much safer when I donate the money than when I don't, because if I'm rich and I don't do anything for my country, that is so much worse. So there are different perspectives on whether, it's important, but in my own experience, I think if people are already doing philanthropy, it is helpful to be public about it, because then you can inspire others to also do it. And of course, we need to find, culturally acceptable ways within our society. And it's not about saying, oh, look at me, I'm a philanthropist, but it's about providing an example, and hopefully others would also follow. I'm coming to the end of it. I know I've been speaking for a very long time, but we're getting into the future outlook. And I have to say that these conversations gave me personally a lot of hope for Brazil as a country. And philanthropy will always occupy a structural place in Brazilian society. But what we're hoping is that it's not about the provision of basic health, education, economic opportunities, protecting the environment, or addressing historical inequalities. We want to always have philanthropy, but ideally it's not focused on the basics. Ideally, those we already have. And it can focus on what I call the pursuits of human ingenuity, which are the arts, the sciences, philosophy, and topics that have always, for many, many, many years, been supported by philanthropy originally. And when I asked for the reasons to believe in the future of Brazil, people cited the generosity of certain families and individuals, the rise of a desire for a more inclusive society, the progress that Brazil has made as a democracy and in terms of poverty reduction, the professionalization of the philanthropic sector overall, the resilience and continuing strengthening of civil society, and the reaction of the whole country during the COVID pandemic, which showed that people can really pull together in the right direction for a major threat. The wishes of the interviewees were for wealthy individuals to change their mindset and increase their giving, and engage in philanthropy, more with a systems change approach. And for philanthropy to focus more on climate change, civic education, and support for democratic institutions. One of the professionals said to me that when I asked what gives you hope, they said, all the things we talked about, an independent and resilient civil society, more grant giving, moving towards trust, valuing the wisdom of local communities. It is all growing, and that can only be good. Yet it is changing slowly, but it gives me hope. And when I asked a different philanthropist, this was a professional a philanthropist, about, what would Brazil look like if we made it? People describe, wonderful place with social justice and more equality. But going back to my original comment about, countries and societies that can make carnival, one of the philanthropists said to me, then we would have paradise on earth. And I fully agree with that. Thank you very much.